Yep, this jade plant is living in water. Not just living, but thriving. As you can see, there's not a lick of soil to be seen, just stones. We'll come back to what these are in a sec. You might be wondering, well, how can that be? Jades are a type of succulent, aren't they? So wouldn't they just die from overwatering? Well, let me explain. 6 months ago, I thought I'd try an experiment to see how a jade plant would fare living in water instead of soil. I've grown plants in water before, but never anything like this. Jades hate overwatering, right? So I thought it would be interesting to see how it would cope surrounded by the stuff constantly. So I set it all up in a video I did for the Chefies on Patreon, and I've been watching the progress ever since. Would it even grow, or worse, would it turn mushy and die? Turns out, no. You can see the size of the plant when I began, and that it's put on a decent amount of growth since. All this growth after me pruning the 2 main stems too. There's also a little baby plant sprouting from the base, so this fella is clearly happy. So how can this be, and what are all those stones about? This plant is living semi-hydroponically, very fancy term for a very simple idea. Instead of soil, the plant is essentially living hydroponically, in water, and the stones are there merely for support to help anchor the plant into the pot. Those stones have a fancy name too, lechuza pond, but you can just as easily use anything you want. Little balls of hardened clay or lacquer is a popular choice, or you can even just use pebbles from the garden, after a good wash of course. The stones you use for support are inert, so offer nothing nutritionally to the plant. We'll come back to this in a bit because it is important if you want to try this yourself. So, overwatering. Why is this plant not dropping dead from root rot? It's simple. Although it's called overwatering, it's not really the water that does the damage. A plant suffers root rot from a lack of oxygen, and water is just the enabler. Soil has lots of little pockets of air that allow the roots to breathe. When we water, those pockets get filled up and the oxygen is displaced. Still with me? Now, the key to any decent soil mix is good drainage. Good drainage so that the air pockets can quickly return to the soil after watering. If the water stays in the soil for a long time because we water too often or don't have good drainage, then the plant's roots start to suffocate from a lack of oxygen. Which leads us to this setup here. There's no soil at all, just water. And because the container has such a large surface area, oxygen is constantly dissolving into that water. The roots can breathe, which means they don't rot the way they would in soggy soil. This doesn't mean it's all plain sailing though. There's a bit of an adjustment period that the plant needs to go through when we make the change. You see, a plant that's lived all its days in soil is adaptive for that environment. They're used to the wet and dry cycle that comes from when we water every week or so. When we made the change and asked them to live only in water, they need to grow roots adapted to living in water. I'll show you how to make the change in detail in a bit, but just know that the plant might slow down in the first month or so as it adapts to that change. So how do you look after a plant in semi-hydro? It's dead simple, and it actually has a ton of benefits compared to soil, one in particular that I'm a big fan of. So in this setup, your plant will live in a plastic nursery pot filled with stones that is then sat in a cache pot. The aim of the game is keeping a reservoir of water in the cache pot topped up so that the plant has constant access to water. We don't want this reservoir to run dry, otherwise those water roots it spent so long developing begin to suffer. So fill the cache pot about a third of the way up, check in on it every few days and top up when it gets to about a quarter full, and that's it. The beauty of this method is that you don't have to worry about giving too much water or watering too often. As long as there's water in the cache pot, the plant will be fine. Now I say a third of the way up the pot, but that's not really an exact science. A bit more or less is fine, as long as there actually is something in there. Before I move on to one of the most important parts of this setup, let me point you in the direction of my Plant Problems Troubleshooting Handbook that you can nab for free in the description. It covers all the main problems that you see with your plants, why they happen, and what to do about it, all in a nice, easily digestible format. Check it out. Now, something that I alluded to earlier that is super important, nutrients. Because there is no soil, the plant is relying entirely on you for nutrients. Plants need 3 primary things to thrive: light, water, and nutrients, so it's important we don't skip this step. Now you're probably thinking, fine, I'll just add some Miracle Grow to the water. And there's a bit more to it than that. There's nothing too complex, but it just involves buying a specific type of fertiliser. You see, normal fertiliser doesn't have the full spectrum of nutrients. It assumes that the soil your plant lives in will provide some of them naturally through natural decomposition. Our little green friend here only has water, so we need to make sure that we provide the full range of nutrients, otherwise he begins to suffer. So a hydroponic fertiliser is what you need. It should say full spectrum on the bottle. They're tricky to find in your local garden centre, so you probably will need to buy one online. I use Houseplant Focus Hydroponics, but there should be plenty of options based on where you live. So let's now move on to how to actually set up a plant in semihydro. In my mind, it's always a good idea to start with a younger plant. You can absolutely go with a mature plant, and there's tons of examples of folks doing this online. But to make the adaptation period a little easier for me, I like to start small. If you wanted, you could always start with a propagated plant too, especially if you propagate it in water. The plant will have grown water roots from the get-go, so the plant is ready. Now I'm going to make the change for this little guy. I think this was a cutting I took last year that I moved into soil, so let's move him into semihydro. This will work for any plant you have. Pop him out of his pot and shake off the excess soil. Have a little fondle and try to remove as much soil as you can. Take your time with this step and try not to destroy the plant like my ape hands tend to want to do. Next is to rinse the roots to remove any bits of dirt lingering around. I like doing this over my sink, but a bucket of lukewarm water works well too. It doesn't need to be spick and span, just get rid of the major bits. By the end, you should have something that looks like this. Now, get a plastic pot that is a suitable size. I'm upsizing mine so that the roots have lots of room to spread themselves. Too small and you'll only need to upsize in a few months. The most important part is that the pot has drainage holes. Grab your medium of choice. Lacquer and pond are popular, but the world is your oyster, my plant friend. Obviously it needs to be something that won't break down in water. I've got this zeolite on hand, so I'm using that. Don't ask me what it is, it's some kind of lava rock I think. Grab your plant and hold it in the pot so that the crown is roughly near the top, and then fill with your stones. It is a little bit tricky and you'll feel like you need 3 hands to stop stones going absolutely everywhere, but by the end of it should be snugly in there. And don't worry too much if the plant is a little bit floppy in its new surroundings. This is because he's not yet anchored in the pot properly. In a few weeks he'll grow roots to bed himself properly in. Grab a nice decorative pot to act as the cache pot and then fill up about 1/3 of the way with your nutrient-rich water. How much fertiliser you added would have depended on what is said on the bottle. For me, it's about 1/2 teaspoon. And there she is, ready to go somewhere bright in your home. Now after you've set all this up, there is an important step you need to do to keep your little guy happy. Flushing with water. Every couple of months, it's a good idea to give the stones a rinse with plain water to wash out any mineral build-up from the fertiliser, otherwise the roots can get a bit salty. Now, let's just touch on why I think this setup is so great and why I'm slowly moving more and more of my plants into semihydro. If you're a subscriber, then you'll have a good idea about what my #1 pet peeve is when it comes to plants. Something that nearly ruins my enjoyment completely. Yeah, fungus gnats. Fungus gnats need soil to breed and do their business, and this setup takes that away completely. It's perfect. And then there's the health of the plant. It seems to me that plants love living in water for some reason. Maybe it's the consistency of water and nutrients they love, but I always see faster growth and healthier foliage. Now jade plants aren't the only ones that this setup works so well for. The best I've ever seen is spider plants. I mean, just look at this. Moving mine to semihydro absolutely transformed it from ugly duckling to majestic swan, and you should watch all about it in the video up here. I'll see you there.